Welcome. Hello, great to see all of you here. We begin this evening with an acknowledgement. The Department of Asian Languages and Literature, along with the University of Washington, acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land that we currently occupy, and upon which we carry out our work of scholarship and teaching. As humanistic scholars, we recognize that a land acknowledgement is but one small act in the ongoing process of confronting difficult realities and of striving to place ourselves in a just relationship with the land, its historical occupants and stewards, and their descendants. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Zev Handel. I'm chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Literature, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 25th Andrew L. Markus Memorial Lecture. And really happy to be with you on this lovely evening in Seattle. It's beautiful outside, even though it's gotten a little warm in here. I'd like to say a few words about Andrew Markus, for whom this wonderful series of lectures is named and in whose memory it is carried forward. Andrew Lawrence Markus was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and educated as a child in American and European schools. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College in 1975 with a BA in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. After studying early modern Japanese literature at Keio University in Tokyo, Andrew Markus received his doctoral degree from Yale University in 1985 with a dissertation on the 19th century Japanese writer Ryutei Tanehiko. After serving briefly on the faculty of the University of Kansas, he came to the University of Washington in 1986 and taught classical Japanese language, literature, and culture here in our Department of Asian Languages and Literature. He was promoted to the rank of associate professor with tenure in 1992, the same year that his monograph on Tanehiko, titled The Willow in Autumn, was published by the Harvard University Asia Center. A review of the book that appeared in the Journal of Japanese Studies said this: anyone with first-hand experience of the difficulty of the texts Markus discusses will find his expertise daunting. The review went on to say that the book will be a rich source of ideas for students of late Edo Japan for years to come. The time and effort Markus put into the book will pay off handsomely in intellectual dividends. Sadly, Professor Markus was unable to enjoy the satisfaction of seeing a generation of scholars and students benefit from his singular work of scholarship. He passed away in October of 1995. First with a symposium held the following year, and then through this series of annual lectures given since 1998. The generosity of Andrew Markus's family and friends has permitted the department to remember him and to commemorate his legacy as a scholar and a teacher by inviting leading researchers from around the world to speak on topics related to Asian languages, literatures, and cultures. On behalf of the department, I would like to express deep gratitude to Professor Markus's family and friends for making possible this very special annual event, which has over 2 decades truly become one of our department's most cherished traditions. Actually now a quarter century. And now, to introduce our distinguished speaker for the evening, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Chris Ham.
All right, good evening, everyone, and once again, welcome to the 25th annual Andrew L. Markus Memorial Lecture. Our speaker for this evening, Michel Hockx, is Professor of Chinese Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also the founding director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asia Studies. Notre Dame is in the state of Indiana, of course. I grew up in central Illinois myself, so I know how to say the name of the school right. Our visitor is actually originally from the other side of the Atlantic, where I understand they might pronounce the name a little bit different. Michel received his undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He taught for many years in the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where he was also founding director of the China Institute before moving to the United States and Notre Dame in 2016. He's also taught as a visiting professor at Harvard University. Michel has been the recipient of grants and fellowships from the Korea Foundation, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, the Jiang Jingguo Foundation, the International Institute for Asian Studies, the British Academy, and other bodies. He served as co-director of the research program, The Social Context of Literary Production, a joint project with the University College London. And he was co-investigator for A New Approach to the Popular Press in China, Gender and Cultural Production, 1904 to 1937, a joint project with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Humboldt Foundation of Germany. He's been the organizer or co-organizer of numerous international conferences and workshops in Europe and the United States, and has given numerous keystone speeches and invited lectures, culminating, of course, in tonight's Markus Lecture. I could keep you here all night detailing Michel's many accomplishments and honors, but to set the stage for his talk, I want to say a little bit about his research and his published work. I first became aware of Michel's work in 1999 when I was making the final revisions to my dissertation. And I'll have to confess that I'd been only vaguely aware of his first monograph, A Snowy Morning, 8 Chinese Poets on the Road to Modernity, when it came out in 1994. But his 1999 edited volume, The Literary Field of 20th Century China, contains several chapters directly related to my dissertation topic, modern Chinese popular fiction, including Michel's translation of an essay by the eminent scholar Chen Pingyuan. It was these chapters that first drew me to the book, but far more consequential than these individual chapters for me, and I dare say for the field as a whole, was the introduction that Michel wrote for this volume. In a brief but lucid essay, he proposed that Chinese literature might be approached not only as it usually is, through the study of texts and the authors of texts and the themes of texts and the ideologies that the texts reflect, but also as a practice, as a form of social activity engaged in by writers, readers, editors, and critics, shaped by and expressive of the societal, institutional, and material conditions within which literature happens. He showed how sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's ideas about cultural capital and the literary field might contribute to our understanding of modern Chinese literature, and also how the Chinese case might reflect on the scope and assumptions of Bourdieu's models. Now, 20 years later, some of these approaches are commonplace, at least in some quarters, but Michel's insights were pioneering at the time and remain invaluable even today. The ideas he outlined in this 1999 edited volume then informed Michel's brilliant monograph, Questions of Style, Literary Societies and Literary Journals in Modern China, published by Brill in 2003. Questions of Style was a radical intervention into literary history. Standard accounts, as many of you know, portray Chinese literary modernity as the invention of a group of May 4th writers who threw off a dead language and a feudal ideology to create a literature of enlightenment. Any 20th century writing that was not allied with this May 4th group or could not trace its genealogy to them was dismissed as neither modern nor really literature. This narrative had been questioned many times, but most previous challenges to the May 4th narrative seemed unable to avoid reiterating and confirming some of its basic premises. Michel presented an entirely new picture of early 20th century China's literary field. Through research into the sociology of literary groups, analysis of their discursive strategies, and the application of insights from the discipline of periodical studies, he sidestepped the well-worn debates and presented a framework that integrated the activities of canonical authors with those of writers who had been long neglected. Scholars had been talking since the 1980s about rewriting Chinese literary history, 重写文学史. Michel's Questions of Style showed us convincingly how this might actually be done. The many lines of inquiry opened up by questions of style played out over the next decade and more in a raft of volumes that Michel edited or co-edited with other leading scholars. These include, but are not limited to, Reading East Asian Writing, The Limits of Literary Theory in 2003, The Global Literary Field in 2006, the monumental Literary Societies of Republican China in 2008, and Women and the Periodical Press in China's Long 20th Century in 2018. In the meantime, not content to rest on his laurels, Michel was turning his attention from the early 20th century to the late 20th and early 21st, and bringing his interest in the social and material contexts of literature to bear on a new phenomenon, Chinese internet literature. Another groundbreaking monograph, Internet Literature in China, was published by Columbia University Press in 2015. In this first comprehensive English language survey of the topic, Michel studies a wide range of texts, literary communities and practices, and platforms for creativity and communication. He investigates the role of the internet in reshaping the relationships between authors and texts, between writers and readers, and between literature and the state. And he shows how even as the literary world is being reshaped, certain familiar categories and patterns of literary practice persist and reappear in novel forms. Tonight's lecture reflects a recent direction in Michel's research, one that I believe grows out of his investigations into Chinese internet literature and the challenges that internet literature raises to established forms of gatekeeping and control. The title of tonight's lecture is Inevitable Impositions, Censorship and Modern Chinese Literature. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest, Professor Michel Hockx.
After such an introduction, I'm truly speechless, so we can all go home now. But seriously, it's a great honor to have been invited to present this year's Markus Lecture. And I'm very grateful to the department for the invitation, and I'm very grateful to the Markus family and friends for supporting this unique series of lectures. Clearly, I work in a very different field from Andrew Markus, but in preparing for this talk, I read one of his articles, an article he published in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 1985 called The Carnival of Edo, Mise-mono Spectacles from Contemporary Accounts. And it struck me that as he gives a very, very thorough description of this phenomenon of mise-mono, which is a type of popular street performance, that he ends up by describing what I believe is an act of censorship, how the mise-mono disappears, in part because it was considered to be lacking in morality, and in part because urban planning in the modern period ensured that it no longer had spaces available to perform itself. And so that combination of moral disgruntlement and sort of official restriction of performance has a lot in common with what I'm going to talk about today. So in that spirit, I would like to start. In his study of Chinese cultural policy of the 1980s, entitled The Party and the Arty in China, The New Politics of Culture, published in 2004, Richard Kurt Krauss warns his readers not to visualize the relationship between censors and cultural producers in China as Bambi meets Godzilla. Censors in China are not just brutes that stamp on their victims, and artists in China are not just innocent, doe-eyed do-gooders. In my own previous writings on censorship, I have so far pursued two somewhat discrete trajectories, which I hope to bring together for the first time in this lecture. When working on censorship of literature in Shanghai in the 1930s, in my book Questions of Style, my focus was on the interactions and negotiations between censors and publishers. When looking at censorship of internet literature during the Hu Jintao era from 2002 to 2012, my focus was on the challenge posed by online literature to the state-imposed book number system, and on the various mechanisms employed by the state to attempt to reduce obscenity in online fiction. Here I focused on the subversive force of popular culture and the various creative ways in which netizens continue to produce and consume erotic material despite increasing censorship attempts. Both these aspects of censorship lend themselves to comparative approaches, that is to say, approaches that work against the widespread inclination to consider Chinese censorship as something so unlike Western traditions that it cannot be studied in the same context or understood by the same theories. So let's turn to theory. Most countries, including People's Republic of China, have legal stipulations regarding the exceptional freedoms enjoyed by works of literature and art. Such works can possess what is called redeeming value, which allows them to have content that would otherwise be considered obscene, defamatory, blasphemous, or even seditious, although the PRC draws the line at sedition, as is well known. As censorship scholar Nicole Moore puts it, literature's categorical expression has depended, in courts of law and regimes of regulation, on its ability to differentiate itself from law's proper object, and the ambiguities at stake have seemed to describe the form as such. In other words, literature relies on censorship for its self-definition. Older approaches to the study of literary censorship focus primarily on what Moore calls the wronged author, or the encoded page, that is, on what censors did to authors or how authors outsmarted them with clever writing. This is still, by and large, how literary censorship in China is written about, if it is written about at all. Most discussions of censorship in the PRC either fail to discuss literature or refuse to acknowledge that literature is censored by different standards. Censorship in China is deemed always to be political, based on standards and methods that are the same, regardless of what type of text or activity is considered transgressive. Of course, by denying that Chinese literature can be different from any other kinds of text when it comes to censorship, such commentators are also implicitly denying that Chinese literature has artistic merit or redeeming value. Its value lies solely in what it can tell us about the political situation in China. This attitude, I will argue later in this lecture, is in itself a form of censorship, intended to uphold a mainstream consensus about how China differs from the West and how an authoritarian state cannot possibly produce good literature, i.e. literature that can be judged by aesthetic rather than political values. When I say that a certain attitude is in itself a form of censorship, I'm referring not to formal censorship, but to structural censorship, the kind of censorship that is based not on legal codes, but on unspoken rules of social propriety, perpetuated by social institutions. It is such an understanding of censorship embedded in all types of social interaction, characterized as they always are by discursive expressions of power relations, that lies at the core of the modern understanding of the phenomenon, as formulated in the 1990s by an academic movement known as New Censorship Studies. New Censorship Studies drew much of its inspiration from post-structuralist studies of language and power, and often specifically from a truly brilliant article on the topic by the late Pierre Bourdieu, the man I can't seem to get away from, in which he defines censorship as a metaphor for social structures that govern both access to expression and the form of expression imposed on all producers of culture. In a special issue of PMLA published in 1994, the late Michel Hockx, a scholar of Slavic and comparative literature, gave this insight one of its most famous formulations, quote, "To be for or against censorship as such is to assume a freedom that no one has. Censorship is. One can only discriminate among its more and less repressive effects." Around that same time, from 94 to 95, a series of 12 conferences about censorship was held at various universities in California. This large-scale and impressive collaborative program on censorship resulted in what's probably the most canonical publication of the New Censorship Studies, the collection Censorship and Silencing, Practices of Cultural Regulation, edited by the legal scholar Robert C. Post. The title, Censorship and Silencing, shows that much of the debate at these conferences revolved around the question of whether or not some sort of distinction ought to be made between what was traditionally seen as censorship and something larger or more subtle that involves silencing people without necessarily making them aware of what is being done to them. One of the most often cited articles in Post's collection was written by Judith Butler and entitled "Ruled Out: Vocabularies of the Censor." And in it she offers the term foreclosure for the type of silencing that seems to be the opposite of formal censorship. Certain possibilities for expression appear to be foreclosed to the extent that they can barely be thought or articulated. However, Butler adds, what are in my view two very important points. First, strict formal censorship and foreclosure are the two extremes on a spectrum that contains a lot of gray area in between. And second, even under censorship regimes, under extreme censorship regimes, individuals are not mere victims. They are subjects that are being produced by a certain system or institution, and as such, they are never just passive. The metaphor of a gray area in which most censorship decisions and censorship-related negotiations take place is a powerful one. The late Professor Jing Wang, in her monograph, The Other Digital China, specifically describes the space for non-confrontational activism in China as the gray zone. And this is the term I will be using throughout this lecture. Let us work with this hypothesis, that it is reasonable and justifiable to bring the postulates of new censorship studies into contact with modern Chinese case studies, and that it is equally reasonable and justifiable to do that without a priori assuming that the communist-ruled period after 1949 must be seen as wholly different from any other period. Echoing Hockx, we can hopefully all agree that censorship is, at any given time in Chinese literary culture, that it is indeed an inevitable imposition on any kind of cultural production, no matter where, no matter when. So with that assumption in the back of our minds, let's work our way through a bunch of illustrative case studies of modern Chinese literary censorship. Some of these have been described in earlier publications by myself and others. Others have been part of my research and teaching in recent years, but have not yet been discussed in published work. Some of them involve outright authoritarian suppression, others are more about structural silencing, and the majority are somewhere in the gray zone. Let's start with a picture. Most talks about Chinese literature start with this picture. How many people know who this is? Right. Just making sure you're paying attention. This is, of course, Lu Xun, widely known as the father of modern Chinese literature and the author of the first modern Chinese short story, Madman's Diary of 1918. So who is this? This is Chen Hengzhe, China's first female university professor, but more importantly in this context, also the author of a short story with the same kind of modern features as Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, but published 6 months earlier. Histories of modern Chinese literature, whether written by Sinophone or by Anglophone scholars, either do not mention her or relegate her to a footnote, so as to protect the status of Lu Xun as founding father. The rationalization is usually that her story was published in a journal for Chinese students in the USA, so not really in China. But that rationalization doesn't make sense since the widely acknowledged first modern Chinese poem, Butterflies by Hu Shi, was published in the exact same issue of the exact same journal. The real reason for the silencing of Chen Hengzhe's voice remains unspoken and is likely related to time-honored social structures that prefer for founding fathers to be men. Speaking of silencing women, who is this? If anyone knows this, I'd be really impressed. This is Gao Jianhua, who was the editor-in-chief of a libertarian fiction magazine founded in 1914, which featured quite a bit of nudity, but also remarkably many contributions by female editors and authors. The magazine, called Meiyu, or Eyebrow Talk, was banned in 1916 at the recommendation of a Beijing-based censorship committee known as the Popular Education Research Association, which had as its task to stamp out immorality and perversion in modern print culture since it was thought to be harmful, especially to the large numbers of newly literate readers educated at state schools after the 1911 revolution. This was a case of straightforward censorship. The committee put eyebrow talk on a blacklist. The Ministry of Justice issued an order for it to be banned, and future sales of it were prohibited. Here we see on the left the first page of Chen Hengzhe's short story One Day, which predated Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, but whose pioneering status has been silenced. And here to the right, we see the provocative cover of the first issue of Eyebrow Talk, edited by Gao Jianhua, published in November 1914. And here we see the members of the Popular Education Research Association. And let's zoom in on the back row. You recognize him? This is indeed Zhou Shuren, the man who only a few years later would become known as the writer Lu Xun. He was responsible for developing the censorship committee's rules for censoring fiction. Lu Xun's role as censor working for the Yuan Shikai government is not something I discovered. Sadly, I would have loved to be the one who discovered that. But it has long been downplayed or intentionally overlooked to protect his posthumous reputation as a great writer, great thinker, and great revolutionary, in the words of Mao Zedong. Even those scholars in China who in recent decades revisited this particular part of literary history focused mainly on Lu Xun's activities without bothering to look at Eyebrow Talk and ask the question whether or not it was actually obscene. At the same time, scholars of modern Chinese women's literature rediscovered Eyebrow Talk because of its many stories authored by women, which have now been studied in great detail, but without mentioning the obscenity accusations and the nudity content, which remains largely silent. In fact, since most scholars of early 20th century Chinese magazines now rely almost exclusively on searchable databases of digitized magazine content, few bother to read entire issues of magazines from cover to cover, or even look at the illustrations that appeared in it, instead focusing solely on texts, thereby silencing, censoring, banning from sight, foreclosing, whatever you want to call it, the visual content of these publications. Are you still with me? Yes. We're only getting started. Lu Xun continued to have a strained relationship with censors throughout his career, as is well known. In the 1930s, he often complained about his texts being butchered by censors prior to publication. In one instance, he even noted that more than half of his original text had been taken out, leaving the other half incomprehensible, which is indeed a very crude form of censorship. It was also not uncommon in those years to see texts published with empty boxes representing characters that had been removed by order of the censors, an indication of how relatively late in the process the censors intervened and how technically difficult it was for the publishers to reset censored texts. Empty blocks, i.e. blank space inside a square outline, have always been and continue to be a graphic representation of censorship in Chinese culture, and we will come across an ironic usage of this convention later in my talk today. What is also ironic is that Lu Xun's reputation as modern China's greatest writer was in part cemented by the very prominent position his work occupied in the 1935 Compendium of China's New Literature, 中国新文学大系, published by the established Liangyou publishing house in Shanghai. This compendium, which was used by scholars of modern Chinese literature as their main corpus well into the 1980s, was almost not published in 1935 because censors in Shanghai would not allow it. The censors demanded that Liangyou publishers would remove Lu Xun's work from the collection, since he was a known communist sympathizer, and in the 1930s the Communist Party was outlawed and underground. Liangyou publishers then attempted to bribe the censor. The censor helpfully indicated that he himself also dabbled in literature, and he would be positively inclined to their requests if they were to consider publishing his work in the famous Liangyou series, which was the publisher's flagship series. In a classic example, Bourdieu would have loved this, in a classic example of the battle between political capital and symbolic capital, the publishers refused. They said, we can publish your mediocre work, but not in that series. That is too much recognition. To which the censor, whose name was Xiang Deyan, then said, well, okay, but can you then at least publish it in a hardback? And the publisher said, okay, but can we then keep Lu Xun in our compendium? And they struck a deal and the anthology appeared. Or so the story goes. And again, I'm not the first person to tell this story. But I have been the first person to corroborate the story, because in 2010 I visited the Fudan Library and I found the title of the census publication in their catalog. So I asked the people at the circulation desk to bring out the book. And they, of course, refused, saying, "This has been digitized. You don't need to see the book, just use the database." To which I went down on my knees and I said, "Please, I only need to see whether or not this book is a hardback or a paperback. I will not touch your book, just show it to me." And they looked at me as if I'd completely gone mad, but eventually they brought out the book. And it was indeed a hardback. Not in the best condition, but hardback. And so the story is true, and this is the bribe that was given to the censor who allowed for Lucian's reputation to be cemented for posterity. So what have we seen so far? Acts of censorship and silencing that relate to canonization, to elite bias against supposedly obscene writing, to protection of the posthumous reputation of canonical figures, to straightforward bans, to intricate negotiations between publishers and censors, and even bribes. Before we now turn to a famous and complicated case of literary censorship in Mao's China of the 1950s, I'm going to give us all a little rest and a break from literature and look at a very famous case of censorship of art from the same period. And I'm sure many of you know this case. This is not a case I have researched myself, but one I often discuss when teaching about censorship in China, because it remains such a remarkable illustration of cultural policy under Mao. This is a very famous painting. Seen as an early highlight of socialist realism in China, a style that was intended to use realist techniques to present optimistic revolutionary messages. The scene here is a very famous one. Mao Zedong announcing the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace. Behind him is the newly elected multi-party leadership of the new People's Republic, as well as leading members of the Communist Party elite. There's a tiny little bit of literary interest there as well, since the famous poet and playwright Guo Moruo appears in the second row. That's him right there, wearing glasses. The artist who painted this large oil painting, Dong Xiwen, first exhibited it in 1953, and it was highly praised by Mao himself. By 1958, he had produced a revised version, replacing the by then discredited and purged General Gao Gang with a flower pot. You see? Yeah. In 1967, at the start of the Cultural Revolution, Dong Xiwen was ordered to remove Liu Shaoqi, who is rather prominently standing here. And so he changed him into Dong Biwu, who had been standing behind him. And so to push him into the second row, he shortened his legs. Look. And then he repainted a bit of the carpet to make it seem as if he was in the second row, and then he changed the face, and then it was Dong Biwu. He refused to add another figure, namely Mao's new number 2, Lin Biao, on the grounds that Lin Biao hadn't actually been there when the ceremony took place. So why the artist felt that removing someone from a historical scene was less objectionable than adding someone to it remains a mystery, or a function of the gray zone, or maybe just another example of negotiation. Right? Further revisions were made later by 2 of the artist's pupils, who actually created a replica of the whole painting rather than make further changes, removing more people to the original, because oil paintings are really hard to change like that. And so in 1979, everybody had to be put back in. So then yet another artist revised the replica and put Liu Shaoqi and Gao Gang and everybody else back in. Some people say he also smuggled a young Deng Xiaoping into the back row, but I can't quite make that out from the image here. But if someone knows more about that, I'd be happy to be educated. I know of no examples from the Mao period where socialist realist writers of literature were asked to repeatedly remove or add characters in their stories or novels after publication, but that does not mean that literary production at that time was not also fraught with political issues. And indeed, many discussions about content would have taken place prior to publication. Although nothing would have been published without explicit political approval, writers still ended up being persecuted, not because they published anything that openly challenged ideological guidelines, but rather because those guidelines kept changing. And what was correct in, say, 1957 could be incorrect in 1958. This is what famously happened with the author Wang Meng, seen here alongside a picture of part of the first page of his 1956 story, The Young Man Who Just Arrived at the Organization Department. Published at the height of the 100 Flowers movement, when the party invited constructive criticism on its functioning, the story highlights issues related to the behavior of dogmatic bureaucrats, contrasting an older generation of party cadres with the revolutionary enthusiasm of the younger generation educated after 1949. The story was lauded by Mao Zedong himself and was widely discussed after publication, but soon thereafter fell victim to the anti-rightist movement that followed and that clamped down on most of the constructive criticism. Wang Meng was branded a rightist and exiled to the countryside for 20 years. Or so the story goes, for instance, in Professor Yunte Huang's introduction to the translation of this story in his anthology entitled The Big Red Book of Modern Chinese Literature. Wang Meng himself actually confirmed later in interviews that he was only briefly punished during the anti-rightist movement, returned to Beijing not long after. Then, as the Cultural Revolution started to take shape, he decided to volunteer to go to the countryside himself, rather than await further political trouble. What the story also does not tell, but what has been analyzed in some detail by the late Professor Rudolf Wagner in his often overlooked book-length study of 1950s Chinese literary culture, is that Wang Meng himself had actually written the story in a much safer manner, worried that it might be too politically provocative. But it was his editor at People's Literature magazine who made changes to the text without asking for Wang's approval, so that his critique became sharper. The editor also included some hints of a love story between the two protagonists as a kind of hook to draw in the reader, again without consulting the author. The editor wanted to be provocative, miscalculated his options as he thought his cultural political faction had the upper hand in the 100 Flowers debates, and suffered the consequences, as did Wang Meng. Just as Dong Xiwen's original painting was eventually restored after the Cultural Revolution, Wang Meng restored his original text and published the story again in 1981 under a slightly different title. There are many topics related to censorship that can be derived from looking at these Mao-era cases, one of them being the importance of looking at the role played by editors in the socialist literary system, remnants of which continue to exist in China today. These stories remind us that any approach to the study of literary censorship that solely focuses on authors is always reductive, since so many more people are involved in publishing a literary work. Whereas authors typically get all the credit for works that are published successfully, in most cases it is not the author who is published when works are censored, but rather the publishers and/or the responsible editor who made a decision to bring the work into the public domain. On October the 30th, 1979, 3 years after the death of Mao Zedong and the end of the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping addressed the 4th conference of the China Federation of Literary and Art Circles, also known as CFLAC. It was a nationwide conference commonly referred to in Chinese as the Wendai Hui, but I'll refer to it as CFLAC going forward. The next day, the full text of Deng's speech appeared on the front page of the People's Daily, and towards the end of his speech, he stated to collective sighs of relief that, quote, "The party's leadership of literature and the arts does not mean issuing orders, nor requiring writers and artists to make themselves subservient to political tasks," unquote. In doing so, he redefined the relationship between CCP ideologues and creative producers, which had become increasingly politicized during the first 30 years of communist rule. He also reintroduced the leader's speech as an important element in cultural policy. Throughout the early 1980s, literary writers and also artists and other cultural producers, as well as scholars studying cultural production, then repositioned themselves away from any kind of involvement with politics, focusing instead on aesthetic experiment and appreciation. The censorship apparatus, in line with the new guidelines announced by Deng Xiaoping, generally let this happen, but continued to be wary of any content that could be considered overly out of step with prevailing ideological messaging. Interestingly, what we see emerging in this context in 1980s China is a phenomenon described by the English literature scholar Annabel Patterson in her book Censorship and Interpretation as functional ambiguity. Patterson argues in relation to literary production in England in the 16th and 17th century that censors, authors, and readers gradually arrived at an understanding, a consensus that literary works could make ambiguous references to taboo topics, and that censors would pretend not to notice the hidden meaning. Thus, writers were granted what we now commonly call poetic license, and censors were spared having to try and interpret every single obscure expression that might be transgressive. Prior to Patterson, scholars of censorship debated the need to distinguish political censorship from other types of indirect expression when it comes to the need to read between the lines. But Patterson argued that in this period in English literature, political censorship was the sole overriding reason for authors turning to ambiguous expression, and that even more importantly, all parties in the process of communication, authors, censors, and readers, were fully aware of the arrangement that allowed them to get away with it. Hence the term functional ambiguity. In time, Patterson argued this time of ambiguity became the model for all literary language until the present day. Well, until modernism, maybe. This analysis I find useful for understanding the emergence of so-called obscure poetry in China in the 1980s. The enormous popularity of this type of poetry, especially of the 1985 anthology pictured here, is undoubtedly related to the fact that poets like Bei Dao, whose name you see in the table of contents there, created ambiguous images and phrases that everybody sensed to have some political meaning, but that was enthusiastically celebrated without overt political debate. Over the course of the decade, the awareness that this type of ambiguity would be permitted in poetry continually strengthened and even survived the 1989 crackdown. The language and imagery pioneered by Bei Dao and his contemporaries is by now the standard language of contemporary Chinese poetry, the norm from which ambitious experimenters try to deviate, but which countless amateur poets on the internet and elsewhere continuously perpetuate. These days, there is among Chinese intellectuals and literary figures much nostalgia for the 1980s as an era of great openness and freedom. Although having myself lived in China during that decade, I sometimes find that difficult to agree with. It is probably more correct to say that the 1980s was an era of great enthusiasm and great expectations, especially in cultural and academic circles, simply because so many new ideas and new sources of information were entering the country all at the same time, and so many previously taboo topics could be discussed again. Yet in literary circles, despite the relaxation of the political demands on writers that were announced by Deng Xiaoping at the 4th CFLAC Congress in 1979, there were still ideological limits in place throughout the 80s. In fact, at the 5th CFLAC Congress in 1988, the leader's speech contained a quote like the following: "Regardless of how many different kinds and shades of artistic creation there might be among us, they can only have one single social function: to awaken the people's sense of historical responsibility towards national revival and social progress, to arouse the Chinese people's spirit of hard work and courage, unity and struggle, and reform and creativity, to raise our people's national self-respect and confidence in order to stand tall amidst the forest of nations in a completely new manner." Now, you won't find this speech on the CFLAC website, which otherwise has all the leaders' speeches from all the CFLAC conferences, all the way from Mao in 1949 to Xi Jinping in 2021. But fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, these speeches also get published the next day on the front page of the People's Daily. So I found my quote actually by looking at the People's Daily from 1988, the front page, where I found the whole text of the speech and also some pictures. The People's Daily front page report carries pictures of a happy crowd of representatives from literary and art circles shaking hands with two arriving leaders. The first is Deng Xiaoping, And the second, right behind him, is of course the then General Secretary of the Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, who would be purged only a year later for his perceived role in supporting the 1989 People's Movement. A second picture down there shows Zhao Ziyang seated center stage. Next to him is Yang Shangkun, who was the president of the PRC at the time. And on the other side is Hu Qili, who was the CCP Standing Committee member in charge of propaganda. And he actually delivered the speech, which sort of emphasizes the continued perception of literature and art being relevant to propaganda. But he was also purged in 1989, which further explains the censoring of this official speech on the official website of CFLAG. Now I'm going to take a sip of water. And I want to move to two very famous cases of more recent literary censorship. One from the Jiang Zemin era, basically the 1990s, and one from the Hu Jintao era from 2002 to 2012. Both of these examples show how the liberalization of the publishing industry in China and the rise of a bestseller system since the 1990s further complicated censorship practices and outcomes. You expected this one, right? The novel Fei Du, or Ruined City by Jia Pinghua, was published by Beijing Publishing House amidst a great hype in 1993. The scholar Jeremy Barmé has described the building blocks that caused the hype: lavish promotion in the media, including rumors that the novel would be full of sex, and that Jia was paid an exorbitant fee by the publisher. And then after it was published and became an instant bestseller, protracted debate in the media and in academic circles about the literary merits and demerits of the novel, including its most famous literary device, the use of empty printed blocks to indicate the number of characters that the author supposedly willingly deleted in order to make sure the sex scenes were not too obscene. I don't believe a word of it, but that's he said he sort of removed those characters. I think he just never wrote them, but that doesn't matter. The use of this device, familiar to Chinese readers from cleansed editions of classic erotic novels such as Jinping Mei, made playful fun of censorship, adding a risque element that would not have been provided by descriptions of sex alone, since that in itself was already no longer a novelty in 1990s China. As Barmé points out, academics and other intellectuals were especially active in the debate, clearly reveling in the fact that for the first time since 1989, they had a public forum again. Predictably, much of the debate revolved around the role of the market in the recently reformed Chinese publishing system. Jia Pinghua was an established author, very much part of the official literary circuit, and even a member of the National Political Consultative Conference. And yet he was selling out, or at least so it seemed, to the forces of capitalism that the Jiang Zemin regime had created, but was trying to keep away from literature and the arts. On January 20th, 1994, the Beijing Municipal Office for News and Publications issued a nationwide order to confiscate all circulating copies of Ruined City. Since the publisher was based in Beijing, it was within the Beijing Municipal Office's jurisdiction to make this decision. It also instructed the publisher to hand over any copies still in stock and to refrain from printing new copies. The publisher was ordered to hand over all profits made and pay a fine equivalent to double the amount of profit. The order points out that all these measures are in line with three relevant legal documents issued in the 1980s. One by the General Administration for Press and Publishing, one jointly issued by the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Finance, and the National Trade Administration, and one jointly issued by the CCP Central Committee and the State Council. Taken together, these three laws supported the case for A, considering the book obscene, B, for a local government to issue a nationwide ban, and C, for the specific financial penalty to be imposed. Of those three, the first one is referred to in the greatest detail, stipulating the exact clauses of the regulation according to which Ruined City could legally be considered obscene and therefore banned. Upon inspection, it appears that these legal clauses are part of obscenity legislation introduced to China in the late 1980s. Like obscenity legislation in other countries, the regulations in question provide some detail as to what type of description of sexual activity counts as obscene. It explains the principle of social harm linking it especially to potential harm caused to young readers. And this is reminiscent of the Hicklin test, which formed the basis of UK and US obscenity legislation well into the 1950s. These principles are referred to in the banning order of Ruined City. The banning order also singles out the device of using empty blocks to indicate words that were removed, stating, in my view correctly, although this does not mean I support the censorship, that this was merely a gimmick to attract even more attention to the lewd content. The one thing that the banning order does not explicitly state, and the only thing they should have really included, was whether or not Ruined City could be considered to have redeeming literary value, since possessing such value would have legally excluded from the category of obscenity. Or to turn it the other way around, as always with this type of legislation, as we've seen in our discussion of new censorship theory, the decision to label a work as obscene automatically means withdrawing it from the realm of literature. So none of this affected Jia Pinghua personally. He continued to write and continued to build a career both inside the PRC and abroad, winning several important literary prizes. Eventually in 2009, 15 years after the original banning, Ruined City was republished, the only change being the removal of the empty blocks. As ironies of censorship go, this one is remarkable. By removing blank space, a publication became unbanned. I'm oversimplifying, but I just couldn't resist saying that. An English translation of the work by Howard Goldblatt, which reinstated the empty blocks, appeared in 2016 in the Chinese Literature Today book series, funded in part by a grant from the Chinese government. The gray zone, right? The case of Ruined City shows anxieties about capitalistic exploitation of the literary market, but it also shows a remarkably correct legal process. If the cultural product banned in this way would have been a hardcore pornographic video, the decision would not have raised eyebrows and would not have received international attention. Or to give a somewhat less random example, the later banning of the Chinese translation of 50 Shades of Grey drew very little attention among freedom of speech advocates outside China. We may want to ask ourselves if our objection to censorship in China is an objection to censorship or an objection to the wrong things being censored. And here's the other one you knew I was going to talk about. The case of Yan Lianke's novella 为人民服务, Serve the People, first published in January 2005 and banned soon thereafter, shows how this changes in the domestic and international media and publishing environment played out in a censorship case. Compared to Ruined City, the description of sex in Serve the People is tame. What made the book transgressive was that the novel was set during the Cultural Revolution and that the sex scenes featured the use of images of and slogans by Mao Zedong as aphrodisiacs. Imagine that. Furthermore, rather than a playful reference to censorship, as in the case of Jia Pinghua's Empty Blocks, Serve the People contains a biting satire of censorship through its ending, when the entire army unit in which the story takes place is dissolved, and all traces of its existence are removed as if it were never there, merely in order to cover up the illicit extramarital relationship between a common soldier and the wife of a high-ranking officer. Like Jia Pinghua, Yan Lianke was already an established and indeed a prize-winning author prior to writing Serve the People. After he finished the manuscript for Serve the People, he offered it to various literary magazines and eventually found a home for it with the magazine Huacheng, or Flower City, based in Guangdong. According to Yan's own account, the original manuscript was 90,000 words. Prior to offering it to Flower City, he himself cut out 40,000 words to make it less potentially offensive, and the editors of Flower City cut out another 10,000 before it was published. Nevertheless, when the January 2005 issue of Flower City came out, it was very swiftly banned by order of the highest authority, the propaganda department of the CCP. And then there's no need for legal procedures, then it's just bam, right? Although I have not seen the actual document that was sent down from the propaganda department, it was widely cited at the time as containing blanket bans on distributing, reprinting, discussing, excerpting, or reporting on Serve the People. Copies of the magazines already distributed were confiscated, Propaganda departments at all local levels were provided with the rationale for the banning, apparently authorized by Standing Committee member Li Changchun and Propaganda Department Chief Liu Yunshan in person. And the core rationale was that the work, quote, slandered Mao Zedong, slandered the lofty purpose of Mao Zedong's famous speech, serve the people, slandered the People's Army, slandered the revolution and politics, as well as its excessive descriptions of sex confuse people's thinking, and that it spreads mistaken Western views. So, pretty bad. I need some more water after citing that. News of the banning spread rapidly, mainly through the internet. We have the internet by now, right? Where copies of different versions of the text quickly began to circulate, as they still do. Chinese language media in Hong Kong reported on the case, citing the official document from the propaganda department, hyping Serve the People as the first banned book of 2005, and even interviewing Yan Lianke himself. In the interview, Yan explained that he, as an author, was free to write whatever he wanted, but that it was the publishers who needed to be careful and might get punished. He stated that he had not been bothered in any way by the authorities after writing Serve the People, and indeed he later went on to alternate successful prize-winning work with other works that received bans. Although nowadays, I don't think he has any opportunities to publish in mainland China anymore. In a later essay about censorship, Yan repeats his claims about his own freedoms as a writer, but mentions specifically that when Serve the People was banned, the responsible editors of the Flower City magazine and those responsible for publishing the magazine have been fined, dismissed, and punished. For those who insist on studying censorship in the perpetrator versus victim model, or the Godzilla versus Bambi model, it might be instructive to realize that in the PRC these days, the most likely victim of censorship is usually not the author, but rather the publisher. And that this is exactly the same in most Western countries. For instance, in the famous trial of Allen Ginsberg's poem and collection, Howl, it was not Ginsberg who was on trial, but his publisher. Again, we see a space here where things connect across the borderline between what is so often presented as a rigidly binary opposition, in this case between authoritarian and democratic systems of censorship. Nevertheless, the case of Serve the People definitely does show a much more authoritarian side of Chinese literary censorship. As in the case of Ruined City, the authorities did have a legal avenue available to them via the country's notoriously strict defamation laws, which, unlike in other countries, forbid defamation of the reputation of individuals who are no longer alive. In other words, an argument about defamation of Mao Zedong would almost certainly have resulted in a ban, but perhaps would have taken longer to effectuate and would have been more publicly visible. Moreover, in view of Mao's status and the significance of Mao's reputation to the overall identity of the CCP leadership, the novella's combination of Mao's image and his famous slogan with descriptions of wanton sexual activity was simply too offensive for the party leadership. It went past their political and their moral bottom line and caused them to use the most effective measure in their arsenal, the immediate ban coming directly from the propaganda department. As I said, boom. Although Serve the People was published in English and several other languages not long after its banning, and although it continued to be available for Chinese readers on the internet, it took until 2020 for a full Chinese language edition to appear outside the mainland, published by City University Press in Hong Kong in 2020. Again, with quotes from the banning order printed on the cover as marketing material, as well as the phrase, "a banned novel that shook the mainland." The magazine Flower City still exists. It has a website. Its website has little descriptions of the contents of every single issue it ever published. The January 2005 issue is there, but one item of content is missing. Guess which one? Serve the People is not listed as part of the contents. Ironically, given the novella's satire of censorship's powers of erasure, it has itself been erased, at least in this particular context. On the other hand, the Duxiu database, the country's largest provider of access to digitized books and magazines, does contain a copy of the table of contents of this particular issue of Flower City and does list Serve the People. Gray zone. By 2008, Grove Atlantic came out with an English translation of Serve the People, marketing it with the slogan, "Banned in China, the sexy satirical sensation," in its promotional material. The publisher also cited the CCP propaganda department's judgment on the novella turning the censor's language into advertising language aimed at an implied audience curious to read banned books from China. The translation identifies Yanlianke as the sole copyright holder of the original text, which means the banning of his work ironically earned him a substantial sum of money. In fact, according to research by Dr. Linda Ng, Yanlianke was ranked in the top 20 of highest earning Chinese authors in 2009. An author who was less lucky and was sentenced to jail for publishing obscene fiction is a woman using the pseudonym Tian Yi, known for producing hardcore work in the genre of boys' love, known in Chinese as danmei. Boys' love fiction is extremely popular in online fan communities around the world. Its authorship and readership is predominantly female, and its subject matter focuses on erotic representations of male-male homoerotic relationships. The genre flourished online in China for about a decade until it came under attack from the authorities as part of a broader effort to curb unhealthy and immoral trends in popular culture. Since then, this type of writing has continued to be popular, but is less prominently advertised on the Chinese fiction websites such as Jinjiang, and the genre category of danmei is typically avoided. What is especially interesting is that this type of Chinese fiction has recently become increasingly popular in English translation among English reading audiences. It has now happened to me more than once in the past year or two that students have come to me at the University of Notre Dame to tell me they decided to pursue a major or minor in Chinese because they are fans of English translations of Chinese danmei, such as this one, which I got from Amazon. I admit that I haven't read it yet, but more than one student has told me that this book changed their lives. And as you're collectively laughing, I think there's an act of censorship going through the room here, right? I think I need to read this stuff. We probably all do. Coming back to the case of Tian Yi, who's not the author of this book. Tian Yi gained much media attention both inside and outside China because she did not limit herself to publishing her work online, but arranged to have it circulated and sold in print, despite not having obtained the official book number. Print publications without a book number are by definition illegal. Print publications without a book number that are obscene and that have made commercial profits are considered a more serious type of illegal publication and receive longer sentences or more severe punishments. In the case of Tian Yi's novel titled Gongzhan, which she translates as Occupy, it was established that roughly 7,000 copies were illegally printed and sold, and that a profit of over 150,000 yuan was made. The author herself, as well as the owner and an employee of the printing shop, the cover designer, and the online bookseller were all arrested and put on trial in November 2018. The media only talked about the author, right? Of course, but there were 5 people on trial. Based on jurisprudence going back to 1998, which stated that illegal sales of obscene publications in more than 5,000 copies and deriving more than 150,000 yuan in profit should be punished with prison sentences of at least 10 years, the author and the printer were both sentenced to 10 years and 6 months in prison. This immediately became headline news, not only in Western media slamming the heavy sentence, the violation of the author's human rights, they didn't really talk about the printer's human rights, the assumed underlying homophobia, but also in Chinese media, where the case was openly discussed and many expressed dissatisfaction, if not disgust, with the fact that this sentence was based on a law from 20 years ago, when a profit of 150,000 yuan on a book publication was considered a massive amount of money, and when social norms in relation to erotic writing, as well as in relation to homosexuality, were very different. All defendants, except for the print worker, who had been given a light sentence, appealed, and the appeal court heard the case a month later in December 2018. By then, the Western media had switched off. I can find no follow-up stories in English language news media covering the appeals hearing, even though it was live streamed on Chinese websites and watched by well over 2 million people, and widely reported on in the Chinese language media. During the appeals hearing, the prosecutor admitted that procedural mistakes had been made in the original case and recommended that the case be remanded back to the lower court. The judge did not immediately issue a verdict. After that, as far as I can tell, although I'm hoping still to find more information, there seems to be silence. It is not clear to me if the appeals court judge agreed to remand the case back to the lower court, if a different verdict was issued, if the author and the print shop manager ever went to prison. I don't know. Gray zone. And so we turn to the final part of the story, which is the part I least enjoy talking about. And that is the overt structural censorship of any kind of nuanced writing about Chinese literature in English language media. So this is going to be a rant. And then I'll finish. I first became aware of this phenomenon in the spring of 2012 when I was still living and working in London. And China was the focus country for that year's London Book Fair, meaning a large delegation of Chinese publishers would be displaying their products at the fair, but also that there would be a substantial cultural program that would feature a visiting delegation of Chinese writers. As scholars of Chinese literature, my colleagues and I were excited about the prospects of these events, and several of us, including myself, advised the book fair on which Chinese writers to invite. Out of the blue, however, what seemed like an orchestrated media campaign in the UK media began to denounce the Chinese writers delegation as consisting only of state-sponsored hacks. Most influential, and in my view most dubious, was an article by the late Jonathan Mirsky, which contained the quote that you will have been looking at by now. Now, his views are not entirely without merit. The following two screenshots show that no works by Gao Xingjian are available in China's largest online bookstore, and that a search for Liu Xiaobo results in the connection with the server being reset. But the suggestion that most of the country's most distinguished writers live abroad and that the delegation that came to London was not worth engaging with was simply untrue. And the London-based Chinese writers I spoke to at the time also did not agree with that. It was in fact an exciting and diverse delegation with representatives including the highly and internationally acclaimed modernist poet Xi Chuan, as well as the online celebrity turned best-selling print author Annie Baobei. Oh, and there was also another giant of Chinese literature in that delegation, whom I had the pleasure of hosting at my institution for an audience of well over 100 people. That's me there, with a younger version of me. And that person, a few months later, won a certain prize, about which most Chinese literature scholars were very excited. But the corporate media once again took a completely different line, with destructive tendencies. Yomi will remember this particular episode, epitomized by the slogan contained in this International Herald Tribune article, "Can great lasting literature come from there?" There meaning China. Of course, we can have endless debates about the definition of great lasting literature, but let's just have a look at some numbers from before Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize. These are the numbers of translated titles of his works in English, French, Swedish, Spanish, and German before he won the Nobel Prize, which made him already then the most frequently translated modern Chinese author, above Lu Xun. Despite such evidence and despite the efforts by several scholars, including myself, to set the record straight, the media debate continued and also came to include some renowned Western writers. Salman Rushdie famously referred to Mo Yan as a patsy of the regime. Of course, Rushdie has a right to his opinion, and he's no stranger to censorship, to put it mildly. But I would politely suggest he should have formulated his opinion after he had actually read some of Mo Yan's work, which he clearly had not. In comparison, Rushdie's own work is widely available in translation in China. The same story with Herta Müller, herself winner of the 2009 Nobel Prize for Literature, who called the award for Mo Yan a catastrophe and decried Chinese censorship, obviously without having read Mo Yan's work and without having any detailed knowledge of Chinese censorship. Her own works, of course, are widely available in Chinese translation in China. The double standard is clearly on display here. Two celebrated authors who publish work that is entirely uncontroversial in China criticize an author who lives and works in China whose work they have never read for not being more controversial. In the study of censorship, as mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we distinguish between formal censorship and structural censorship. Formal censorship is what we often see in China, as in the example of my searches just now for Gao Xingjian and Liu Xiaobo. It is a state-driven restriction of access to specific types of speech. Similarly, the 9 types of speech not protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution are also subject to formal censorship. Structural censorship, like structural racism, is ingrained deeply in how communities function. It is, as Pierre Bourdieu memorably put it, an imposition of form that characterizes the shaping of speech in specific social fields, often without its practitioners being aware of it. I suggest that the media-driven imposition of politicized discourse about Chinese literature here in the US and more broadly in the Euro-American world is exactly such an imposition. It is a form of transnational censorship that absolves its practitioners from the need to know what they are talking about, and that has increasingly real consequences for those of us who want to resist it without being subjected to political accusations. Here, with some hesitation, I would like to raise an experience I recently had myself. When I submitted a grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities, setting out my intention to write a book that would contain a nuanced study of literary censorship in 20th century China, something like this, one of the anonymous reviewers did not even feel the need to judge my work by humanities standards, or even by academic standards, and simply said that writing such a book was, quote, inappropriate right now because of what is going on in Xinjiang, etc., unquote. I have no solution and no hope that this will change anytime soon, but I thought I'd throw it out there as a final case example, or maybe I'm just venting. It has been my explicit intention in this lecture to dazzle you with countless examples of modern Chinese censorship of literature that are all different, that are all complex, and that are all firmly located in the gray zone, which we have to study if we want to take this topic seriously. None of what I have said should be construed to suggest that I have any sympathy for the Chinese regime, or that I do not oppose the serious violations of human rights that are taking place in China on a daily basis. Everything that I have said should be understood to make the strongest possible case for the study of censorship of literature as having its own complexities that require in-depth study, understanding of nuance, and awareness of the unique characteristics of literary communities and their relation to the state. Only if we are in command of the facts and the details of individual cases can we convincingly launch a critique of the authorities that implement censorship. Reductive approaches to the study of literary censorship in China, just because it happens in China, are to be silenced. Thank you.